The boy came to us on a Tuesday. It was a day like any other, a day filled with promises of normalcy that felt long overdue. The rain had just let up, the sun breaking through a sky that had been dark for far too long. I still remember the smile on his face when the orphanage director led him out by the hand, his fingers grasping hers with all the innocence of a child. He was small, barely 9 years old, with wide blue eyes and a mop of unruly brown hair. His name? Well, that doesn't matter now. What matters is the game. The first night, it all seemed harmless. He asked if we could play hide and seek, his voice soft, eyes pleading. It seemed like a simple request, a child eager to bond with his new family. My wife, always the softer of the two of us, agreed immediately. I was less enthused, but I went along with it. After all, he was just a kid, and what harm could a game bring? I'll never forget the way he smiled when we agreed. It was too wide, stretching across his face like it didn't quite fit. But I brushed it off. The smile of a child, I told myself. Nothing more. The rules, however, were strange. He explained them with the precision of someone far older than his years. "You'll hide and I'll count," he said, his voice taking on an eerie sing-song quality. "But there's a rule. If I find you, something bad happens." We laughed it off, assuming it was part of the game. Children like to scare adults sometimes. It makes them feel powerful. So we played. My wife and I ducked behind curtains, squeezed into closets, and crouched under tables, stifling our laughter as we heard his small feet pattering through the house. He found me first. The way his hand touched my shoulder was too cold for a child, but I figured it was just the air conditioning. His eyes, though, they didn't match the laughter that escaped his lips. They were dead, hollow, but it was just a game, a child's game. My wife stayed hidden longer, and as the minutes ticked by, the fun started to fade. There was something off about the way he moved through the house. His footsteps were deliberate, like he knew exactly where she was. But he was taking his time, almost savoring the moment before the discovery. When he found her, tucked away behind the couch, his smile widened again, stretching too far, too thin. He whispered something in her ear that I couldn't hear from where I stood. She laughed awkwardly, but there was fear in her eyes. The first night ended without incident. But the next morning, my wife found scratches on her arm. Thin red lines that hadn't been there the night before. She blamed the cat, but we don't own a cat. The second night, he asked to play again. This time, his voice was softer, more insistent. There was an edge to it, a threat beneath the request. My wife hesitated, but I agreed. I didn't want to scare him, to make him feel unwelcome. Not yet, at least. The rules were the same, but the stakes felt higher. My stomach churned as we slipped into our hiding places, the house colder than it had ever felt. I hid in the basement, behind a stack of old boxes, my breath coming in shallow gasps as I listened to his footsteps echo above me. He took his time again. Too much time. It was like he was playing with us, drawing it out, letting the fear sink in. And when he found me, it wasn't the cold hand on my shoulder that made me shudder. It was the way he looked at me, like he was seeing something else. Something he wanted. Something he needed. This time, when he found my wife, she didn't laugh. She screamed. It was short, sharp, and strangled, cut off by the snap of his small hand clamping over her mouth. I ran to her, but when I reached them, they were standing side by side, both smiling. Only her smile didn't reach her eyes. I asked what had happened, but neither of them answered. The game, it seemed, was over for the night. That night I didn't sleep. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. Not just him, but something darker, something ancient lurking in the corners, waiting. My wife slept soundly, too soundly, her chest rising and falling in an unnatural rhythm, like she was under some spell. The third night was different. I told him we couldn't play, that we were tired, but he insisted. His eyes bore into me, unblinking as he said, "If we don't play, the game changes." There was no choice. We played. This time it wasn't just hide and seek. This time the rules had changed. And as I crouched in the attic, heart pounding, I realized we weren't hiding from him. We were hiding from something else entirely. The third night began in silence. Not the comforting kind of silence that comes when the world is calm, but the suffocating kind, where every creak of the floor, every gust of wind outside feels like it's hiding something just out of sight. Something that you can almost sense but can't quite see. He stood in the center of the living room, small and still, watching us as though he already knew how the night would end. His eyes glinted in the dim light, that same unnerving smile still painted across his face. My wife looked pale, almost sickly, her skin a shade too ashen, but she said nothing. Not to me, not to him. It was as though she was waiting for him to speak first, waiting for permission. "I'll count," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "But tonight I won't be the only one looking." I felt my blood run cold. He stared at me when he said it, like he was daring me to question him, daring me to refuse. But I didn't. I couldn't. My wife wouldn't meet my eyes, and that only made the knot in my stomach twist tighter. He started counting. 1, 2, 3. My wife and I scattered instinctively like prey being hunted. The house felt darker tonight, the shadows deeper, the air colder. I could hear her footsteps as she ran down the hall, and I bolted up the stairs, heading for the guest room. 4, 5. His voice echoed through the walls, every number stretching longer than the last, slow and deliberate. The walls seemed to close in around me as I shoved myself into the closet, pulling the door shut behind me. My breath came in shallow gasps, my pulse hammering in my ears. 6, 7? I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping that somehow this time would be different. That maybe, just maybe, it was still a game. But deep down I knew better. We weren't playing anymore. This wasn't hide and seek. It was something else. Something far worse. 9. The house fell into an unnatural quiet as he neared the end of the count. The kind of silence that claws at your sanity, begging you to make a noise just to break it. But I stayed still, barely breathing, listening for any hint of movement. At 10, then there was nothing. No footsteps, no whispers. Just an oppressive silence that stretched on and on. I waited, straining to hear him moving through the house, but there was nothing. And that was when the real fear set in. Suddenly there was a creak, a loud, drawn-out groan of wood bending under weight. It came from directly above me, the attic. Something was up there. Something moving, slow and deliberate, scraping along the floorboards, inching closer to where I hid. My skin prickled with dread, my breath hitching in my throat. He said he wouldn't be the only one looking tonight. And now I knew what he meant. I heard a soft knock, not at the door of the closet where I was hiding, but from the ceiling, like something tapping from above. I pressed my hand against my mouth to stifle the sound of my breathing, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might give me away. The scraping sound grew louder, closer, like claws dragging along the wood. Then, without warning, the closet door creaked open. Slowly, painfully slow. There was nothing there. Just the empty hallway, dimly lit by the moon filtering through a nearby window. I held my breath, waiting for something, anything to move. But it was still. Too still. I stepped out of the closet, cautiously, glancing down the hall. Nothing. But then I heard it. A whisper. My wife's voice. Calling from downstairs. "Come out. It's safe now." Something in her voice was wrong. It wasn't her usual soft tone. It was hollow, lifeless. I stepped toward the stairs, my foot hovering over the first step when a cold, sharp breeze hit the back of my neck. I froze. Then came the second voice. His voice. The boy. "She's lying." I spun around, and there he was, standing at the end of the hallway. His eyes were darker than before, gleaming with something I couldn't place, something inhuman. The smile had stretched wider, impossibly wide now, cutting across his face like a jagged wound. And then I heard her again, my wife's voice, closer now. "Come on, let's finish the game." I felt trapped between the two of them, but the thing that stood at the end of the hall, that thing wearing the boy's face, wasn't waiting. He started walking toward me, his footsteps impossibly slow, like he had all the time in the world. I turned and bolted down the stairs, my heart slamming in my chest as I fled into the kitchen. My wife stood by the table, her back to me still as a statue. "I don't want to play anymore," I whispered, my voice cracking. She didn't move, didn't turn around. "I don't want to play anymore!" I shouted this time. But there was no answer. Slowly she turned to face me, her eyes empty, her lips twisted into a grotesque smile. It wasn't my wife standing there anymore. "Game's not over," she whispered, her voice a low hiss. And then, the lights flickered, plunging the room into darkness. I wasn't alone in the house anymore. Something else had joined the game. The darkness swallowed the room whole, leaving me stranded in the cold silence of the house. My wife, or whatever was pretending to be her, stood perfectly still in front of me, her smile twisted into something grotesque. My breath caught in my throat as I stumbled back, knocking into the counter behind me, feeling the chill of the marble seep into my skin. "Game's not over," she had said, and her voice echoed in my head, a distorted, unnatural mockery of the woman I had once loved. The air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me from all sides. My eyes strained to adjust to the darkness, trying to find some hint of movement, some clue of where the boy, no, that thing, had gone. I could feel it, though. The presence. The same thing I'd felt lurking in the corners of the house, always just out of reach, just out of sight. It was closer now, closer than ever before. A creak from the floorboards upstairs broke the silence, followed by soft, rhythmic footsteps. Too light to be human. Too precise. Whatever it was moving slowly, deliberately, making sure I knew it was there. It was part of the game. It wanted me to feel the fear, to let it seep in and take hold. I glanced back at the thing wearing my wife's face. She hadn't moved. Her eyes were locked on me, wide and empty. Her smile too wide, too sharp. And then the kitchen door creaked open. The boy stepped in, but he wasn't alone. His eyes, those dead, hollow eyes, locked onto mine, and I felt a cold rush of terror shoot down my spine. Behind him, in the doorway, a shadow loomed. Something tall and twisted, with long, thin limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally. Its form barely visible in the darkness, but its presence unmistakable. It moved with a slow, deliberate grace, like it was savoring every second of the game. The boy's voice broke the silence, his tone calm, almost playful. "Ready for the next round?" I couldn't speak. My throat was dry, my mind spinning, searching for some way out, some way to end this nightmare. But there was no escape. Not anymore. "I don't want to play," I managed to choke out, my voice shaking. The boy's smile grew wider, his eyes gleaming with something sinister, something ancient. "You don't get to stop. Not until we're finished." The shadow in the doorway seemed to pulse, growing larger, its form shifting in the darkness. I could feel its eyes on me, even though I couldn't see them. It was watching, waiting for the game to take its next turn. And then, in the silence, I heard a sound that made my blood turn to ice. A soft, wet drip. I looked down. Blood. A thin trail of it leading from the kitchen to the hallway. I followed it with my eyes, back toward the living room. My wife, or whatever that thing was now, stood there, her head cocked to the side, staring at me with those empty, soulless eyes. Her arms hung limply at her sides, and I realized the blood was dripping from her fingertips. But it wasn't just her blood. There was more. Much more. It was pooling around her feet, spreading slowly across the floor, thick and dark. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed away, but the boy stepped forward, blocking my escape, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "Do you want to know where the blood came from?" I didn't answer. I didn't want to know, but my eyes drifted, almost involuntarily, back to the trail. It led toward the basement door, the one I had locked the night before. The door was ajar now, hanging open just a crack, and from that crack the smell hit me. Thick, metallic, and nauseating. Something was down there, something I hadn't seen before. "Go look," the boy said, his voice sweet, coaxing. "Go see what happens when you lose." I shook my head, taking a step back, but my feet felt like lead, my body refusing to move. The shadow at the doorway shifted again, inching closer, its presence suffocating, filling the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. I couldn't stay here. I had to move, had to run. But the boy wasn't going to let me go that easily. "If you don't play, the game gets worse," he whispered, his smile never fading. My eyes flicked to my wife again. The blood kept dripping, steadily, relentlessly, pooling around her shoes. And then she took a step toward me, her smile widening, her head tilting at an impossible angle. "We don't like quitters," she rasped, her voice distorted, not hers anymore. I had no choice. I turned and ran. I bolted down the hallway, past the basement door, past the blood, past the shadows. My heart pounded in my chest as I stumbled into the living room, the walls closing in around me. But the house wasn't safe. I knew that now. There was nowhere left to hide. I could hear their footsteps behind me. Both of them, the boy and my wife, moving in unison, like they were connected, like they were something more than just human. And the shadow followed, gliding through the dark, its presence suffocating, its hunger palpable. I reached the front door, my hands fumbling with the lock, my breath coming in ragged gasps. But the door wouldn't budge. The lock refused to turn. The boy's voice whispered in my ear, though I hadn't heard him come closer. "You can't leave. Not until the game is over." I spun around and there they were, both of them standing side by side. My wife's face was wrong, distorted, her eyes black pits, her smile too wide, her hands stained with blood. The boy grinned up at me, his eyes gleaming with sadistic delight. And behind them the shadow stretched, its long thin fingers reaching toward me. Then, the house itself seemed to breathe, the walls groaning, the floorboards creaking as if something ancient was waking up beneath us. The game wasn't over. It had only just begun. The house groaned around me, the walls seemingly pulsing with a life of their own. The boy and my wife, no, the thing wearing her face, stood in front of me, their eyes dark pits, their smiles twisted with malicious glee. Behind them, the shadow loomed, its grotesque form stretching and shifting as it reached for me. I felt my heart hammering in my chest. My hands were slick with sweat as I fumbled with the door, but I knew the truth now. The door wouldn't open. The house wouldn't let me leave. It was all part of the game. "You can't run," the boy whispered, his voice sweet, dripping with mockery. "You're in my world now." For a moment I froze, the weight of fear and hopelessness pressing down on me. It was overwhelming, the kind of terror that paralyzes you, that makes you feel like there's no way out. But then something inside me shifted. It was small at first, barely noticeable, but it grew. a flicker of resolve, of anger. No, I wasn't going to let this thing, whatever it was, win. This wasn't just a game. It was a battle for my life, for my wife's life. I stood up straighter, taking a deep breath. The boy's eyes widened, just slightly, as if he could sense the change. I stepped forward, forcing myself to meet his gaze. "You want me to play?" I said, my voice low and steady. "Then let's play." For the first time, his smile faltered. It was brief, but I saw it, a flicker of uncertainty. The shadow behind him rippled, and I knew I had hit something, some hidden weakness in this twisted nightmare. "Come on," I continued, stepping closer. "Show me your rules, but I'll warn you, I don't lose." The boy's smile returned, but now it was forced, strained. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, I reached out, grabbing my wife's arm. The skin beneath my fingers was ice cold, but I didn't let go. "Wake up," I whispered to her. "I know you're still in there. Wake up." For a moment, nothing happened. The shadow shifted behind her, growing darker, more oppressive, and I felt a wave of dread wash over me, but I didn't let go. Then slowly, painfully, her eyes changed. The blackness receded, just a little, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I saw a glimmer of recognition in her gaze. She blinked, her mouth twitching as if she were fighting against something holding her in place. The boy's smile vanished entirely. His eyes burned with rage as he stepped forward, reaching out to grab me. But I wasn't afraid anymore. "Get away from us," I said, my voice steady. And then, I did something unexpected. I pulled my wife close, wrapping my arms around her in a tight embrace. I could feel the coldness of her skin, the unnatural stiffness in her body, but I didn't let go. I wouldn't let go. "You can't have her," I whispered into her ear. "Come back to me." The shadow roared behind us, its form shifting and twisting, trying to reach us, but it couldn't. The boy screamed, a high-pitched, unnatural sound that pierced the air, but his power was slipping. I could feel it. My wife's body jerked in my arms, her breathing ragged, shallow. But slowly, agonizingly slowly, the coldness began to fade. Her skin grew warmer beneath my touch. Her arms, once limp and lifeless, moved, wrapping around me. And then she whispered my name, her real voice, the voice I had been waiting for. "I'm here," she breathed, her body trembling. The boy stumbled back, his eyes wide with fury, with confusion. He looked between us and the shadow, his expression twisting with anger and fear. He wasn't in control anymore. The house groaned again, the walls shuddering as if the very foundation was crumbling. The shadow, now frantic, lashed out, but it was weakening, its form dissolving, becoming nothing more than a flicker in the corner of my vision. I turned to face the boy one last time. "Game over," I said, and with that the boy's form flickered, his body distorting as the shadow retreated. He let out one final scream, a sound that echoed through the house like the dying wail of some ancient, forgotten creature. And then, in an instant, he was gone. The shadow, the darkness, the oppressive weight, all of it vanished. The house fell silent. The air felt warm again, alive. I looked at my wife, her eyes now clear, her skin flushed with life. She stared back at me, confused but alive. Really alive. "We did it," she whispered, her voice trembling. I nodded, pulling her close. "Yeah," I said softly. "We're done." We walked out of the house together, hand in hand, stepping into the fresh air of the morning light. The nightmare was over, the game was finished, and we had won.